The cold autumn wind swept across the old, desolate fields of Vermont. Daniel Hayes, a single dad, pulled his beat-up truck to a stop in front of the neglected wooden farmhouse he had bought for a bargain. He sighed. At least my daughter Lily has a roof. 3 weeks later, Daniel returned with repair supplies. The lock was cut, the door wide open. Inside, the damp wood smell was replaced by the warm scent of wood smoke. An oil lamp flickered, and quiet women's laughter drifted from the kitchen. Clutching his sledgehammer, Daniel stepped in. Two strange women sat eating soup, as if this had always been their home. One turned, her gaze steady. You've returned? Daniel Hayes, 36, was a man running on fumes, a potent mix of grief and duty. The painful, drawn-out divorce was finally behind him, but the loss of his wife, Megan, in a tragic accident 3 years prior, had shattered the foundation of his life. Once a successful civil engineer in Boston, Daniel had been spiraling, losing his job, and eventually realizing the city, with its sharp, painful memories, was slowly suffocating him and his daughter. He carried a profound, silent shame. The shame of not being enough to keep his family whole. Even though Megan's death was not his fault, he felt like a failure, and this broken house felt like the only place he belonged. Lily Hayes, 8, was a bright, remarkably resilient little girl, but the trauma of loss manifested in one heartbreaking, constant question. Daddy, when is Mommy coming back? Her drawings, usually filled with vibrant color, now often featured an empty space where her mother should be. Daniel knew he needed a radical restart. He needed a place cheap enough to afford with his dwindling savings and distant enough to feel like a new life. That place was the farmhouse in rural Vermont. It had been abandoned for over 20 years, a skeletal structure standing forlornly amid overgrown fields. Daniel had acquired it for a song at a foreclosure auction. The house was a disaster. The roof sagged, the plaster walls were damp and crumbling, and wild ivy had strangled the windows, filtering the light into a sickly green hue. But to Daniel, it was a blank canvas, a chance to build something that grief couldn't touch. It's ugly, sweetie, he admitted to Lily as they first toured the property, crunching through broken glass and leaves. But Daddy promises he will make it beautiful and safe. We'll make it ours. Pointkern. They spent 2 grueling days cleaning debris, shoring up a few structural weaknesses, and burning piles of trash in the yard, sleeping in their worn-out SUV to save money. They sealed the doors with a heavy chain and padlock, securing their sparse tools inside, before heading back to the city to finalize the paperwork and gather more substantial supplies. 3 weeks later, Daniel returned. The truck was loaded with paint, lumber, new window panes, and a sledgehammer, the tools of reconstruction. He felt a nervous energy. This was his fresh start, his salvation. He immediately noticed the front door. The heavy chain was gone. The padlock, cut clean through, lay rusting on the porch. A paralyzing cold fear shot through him. He was ready to face squatters or vandals. He grabbed the sledgehammer, but when he stepped inside the musty air, the scent of dust was gone, replaced by the faint, earthy aroma of pine and wood smoke. A small oil lamp cast a warm golden glow. The kitchen table, which had been covered in rat droppings, now held a fresh loaf of bread and 2 steaming bowls of soup. And there they were, 2 women, one middle-aged and one young, seated at the small table, their posture relaxed, comfortable. They looked up at him, the rightful owner standing in the doorway like an intruder, with unsettling calm. The older woman, Grace, spoke first, her voice tired but steady. You must be the owner." Daniel's grip tightened on the sledgehammer. He dropped his bag of tools, the metal clanging on the rough floor. "Yes, I am. And who exactly are you? And why are you in my house? This is a felony, madam." The younger woman, Elena, flinched violently, shrinking back slightly, burying her face in her hands. Grace, however, did not waver. "We meant no harm. We only sought shelter. We used to live here." Daniel couldn't decide whether to unleash his anger or feel profound pity. "This house has been abandoned for 20 years. I have the title, the deed, the receipts. It's mine now, legally, Everything you see is my property. Not to us, Grace replied softly, dipping her spoon into her bowl. Not in memory. A local gas station attendant later recounted seeing Daniel's truck parked outside that night. He stood outside that house for a good 5 minutes, just staring through the window. He looked stunned, utterly speechless. You could see that soft, yellow lamplight coming from inside. The kind of light no abandoned house ever has. It looked like a home, and that's what threw him. Daniel stood frozen, his mind racing through the options. Call the sheriff, demand they leave, or simply walk away and let the town deal with the mess. Yet the sight of the two women, their meager belongings neatly stacked in a corner, and the comforting aroma of the simmering soup stopped him. He lowered the sledgehammer, setting it gently against the damp wall. He noticed Elena's extreme fear. She looked less like a hardened trespasser and more like a hunted creature. Grace, 55, had prematurely silver hair and eyes that held the deep exhaustion of someone who had seen too much hardship, yet remained fundamentally kind. She had a simple but dignified presence. Elena, 27, was pale and thin, with strikingly blue, sorrowful eyes that never quite met his. She wore a patched, worn sweater and seemed fragile, leaning on Grace for quiet support. Please, Grace said, sensing his decision hanging in the balance, her voice dropping to a plea. Don't call the police. We haven't stolen anything, not a nail. We just needed a temporary shelter. A few days to find our footing. We are truly desperate, Mr. Hayes. We're out of options. Her hands, calloused and veined, trembled slightly as she clasped them together. This vulnerability chipped away at Daniel's resolve. You realize trespassing is a crime, Daniel countered, his voice flat, but the aggression was fading. He felt a sickening internal conflict, the need to protect his property, battling the memory of his own family's sudden homelessness after Megan's death. We do, Grace nodded, but perhaps you don't realize what this house truly is to us. She gestured toward the far end of the hallway. This house was used as an emergency triage and temporary shelter after the Great Storm of 2001. A devastating event, Mr. Hayes. The town was crippled. She continued, her voice gaining a narrative strength that commanded Daniel's attention. I volunteered as a local nurse then. I remember the endless rain, the fear, the smell of burnt wood. This young lady was born in that room, right there. She pointed to the small, clean room. 27 years ago, amidst the chaos. It's the only place on earth Elena has ever known as a true starting point. It's her genesis. Daniel glanced down the hall. The small room had been cleared and contained only a few faded blankets, a tattered copy of the Bible, and a blurred, decades-old frame photograph placed reverently on the mantelpiece. The room felt hallowed. He saw the faint outline of a cross scratched into the wooden wall, a marker of desperate faith. The floorboards, usually cold and echoing, were covered in simple woven mats, muting the noise. They had made a sanctuary out of ruin. He couldn't bring himself to evict two vulnerable women into the freezing Vermont night. He had been alone and desperate himself not long ago. Stay the night, he conceded, rubbing the tension from his temples. We'll figure this out in the morning. But this ends tomorrow. I need to start my life here. Do not mistake this for charity. It's a temporary reprieve. As if summoned by the change in tone, Lily, who had been hiding behind Daniel's legs, cautiously emerged. She looked at Elena, whose thin face seemed to carry the weight of the world. Did you make pie? Lily asked, her eyes lighting up at the warm smell. Elena, despite her reserve, offered a genuine, gentle smile. It was the first time Daniel saw her express any emotion beyond sadness. Just a small fruit tart, she replied, picking up a pastry. She knelt down and offered it to Lily. Your father must be a very kind man, Grace observed, stirring the soup. To allow strangers to eat his bread in his own home. Daniel managed a weak, dry smile. I suspect I'm just naive, or maybe just too tired to fight tonight. Or maybe I just need to feel the smell of cooked food in this place for once. The shared moment of unexpected humor eased the tension in the dusty room. That night, the four of them ate together by the flickering light of the oil lamp. The silence was not awkward, but companionable, filled with the warmth of the fire and the shared meal. It felt strangely domestic. Daniel found himself watching Grace and Elena interact with Lily, a simple, easy maternal warmth he hadn't realized he missed. The next morning, Daniel was astonished. Grace had scrubbed the entire kitchen clean. Elena was outside, hanging their damp blankets on a makeshift line, and Lily was sitting on the porch, giggling as the two women taught her a simple knitting pattern using old yarn. Daniel approached Grace, his legal irritation replaced by pure curiosity. "Why here? Why not anywhere else?" Grace's gentle eyes met his. "I lost my own small cottage to debt and illness, Mr. Hayes. As for Elena," she lowered her voice, "she has no one. She has lived on the street, moving from one anonymous shelter to the next. She is completely isolated. This is her last anchor." Elena stopped knitting, her head bowed in shame. "I just wanted to be where my mother last lived," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "She died right in that room, during the storm. She never left this house." Daniel went utterly still. The weight of his purchase suddenly felt unbearable. "I thought I bought an abandoned house," he murmured, looking at the faded picture in the small room. "I never thought I bought someone else's living memory. I thought I was bearing my pain, not finding someone else's." A postal worker who regularly drove past the isolated farm reported the change. "The first time I saw the three of them, a single dad, an older woman, and a young girl, sitting on the porch together, they were laughing. It looked like a real family. That father looked like he had finally found the piece of himself he'd been missing since his wife passed." The next day, Daniel began working on the basement, a subterranean labyrinth of damp earth and broken pipes. He was methodical, channeling his lingering grief into hard physical labor. Beneath a collapsed wooden workbench, he found an old, heavily rusted metal mailbox. He hammered the lock until it broke, the metallic clang echoing loudly in the oppressive silence. The basement was cold, dark, and felt like a coffin, a perfect echo of the despair he usually suppressed. He pried it open with his crowbar. Inside, amidst layers of dried mud and dust, was a single, fragile letter, halfway addressed and unsent. The handwriting was shaky, clearly written in haste or distress. It felt hot and heavy in his hand, a relic from the past he tried so hard to outrun. Daniel wiped the paper clean and began to read the fading ink. "To whomever may read this, thank you. Thank you for the heroic soul who pulled my daughter from the burning vehicle on the highway back in 2015. I owe you my life, though I know you paid the ultimate price to save her. I pray you are at peace. Signed, Grace Whitmore." Daniel's blood ran cold. The letter was a physical anchor dropped directly into his most painful memory, the accident that killed his wife. He climbed the stairs, clutching the letter, his hands shaking violently. He found Grace peeling potatoes in the kitchen. "Grace," he said, his voice a low, dangerous whisper. "This letter, is it yours?" Grace looked at the paper, her eyes widening in recognition, then filling instantly with tears. She nodded, sinking onto a stool. "Yes, I wrote it after I was finally well enough to try and track down the family. I wanted to thank the woman who pulled Elena out of the wreckage of our car before it exploded on the highway. I was driving. I survived. Elena was trapped. She died moments later, trying to help another victim." Grace choked on the last words, her grief as fresh as if it happened yesterday. Daniel felt the world tilt. He gripped the wooden countertop to steady himself, his knuckles white. "Her name," he forced out, the words catching in his throat. "What was her name?" Grace looked at him, confused by his raw intensity. "It was a common name. I only heard it once. Megan Hayes. She was truly an angel. The police mentioned she had a little girl waiting for her at home." Daniel released the counter, the letter fluttering from his numb fingers and landing silently on the dusty floor. Megan, his wife. The world stopped. The distance he had traveled to escape the name had been precisely zero. The kitchen, moments ago warm with the scent of soup, became a vacuum of silence. The air was thick, pressurized with shock. Grace stared at him, recognition dawning on her exhausted face with horrifying clarity. "Mr. Hayes! Daniel! Dear God, you are her husband?" Daniel could only nod, tears silently tracing paths down the grime on his cheeks. He looked across the room at Elena, who was standing by the stove clutching a rag, her own eyes wide with fear and realization. And Elena, he suddenly saw not a trespasser, but a ghost, a living reminder of the good he had lost. Elena burst into wrenching sobs, falling to her knees. "I am the baby she saved. I am alive because of your wife. Every day, I live for her. I come here because the accident happened just off the old state road. This house is the closest safe place to where she died." Daniel stumbled backward, hitting the wall. The despair he had carried for 3 years suddenly fractured into a complex, overwhelming mix of agony and gratitude. His head screamed with the irony. He had run hundreds of miles from his grief, only to find the living consequence of his wife's final moments literally occupying his new home. "I thought I bought this house to forget the past," he choked out, his voice thick with tears. "I thought I bought an empty space to start over, only to find myself face to face with the very reason I am still breathing. The very reason Lily still has a parent." He pushed himself off the wall and walked slowly towards Elena, kneeling down before the crying girl. "You don't owe me anything," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "I owe you, because you make her sacrifice, the last thing she ever did, mean something. You are the proof that her kindness outlived her body. You are the hope I lost. You are the missing piece of my final conversation with her." Later that day, the four of them sat on the rickety front porch, the cool autumn wind whistling through the missing floorboards. Grace reached out and took Daniel's hand, holding it tight. "Perhaps, Mr. Hayes," she whispered, her voice full of ancient wisdom, "God brought you back to this specific house. He brought you here to close the circle for her. He gave you a new purpose in your grief. You didn't buy a house, Daniel. You bought destiny." "And for me," Daniel admitted, looking from Grace to Elena and then at Lily, who sat quietly between them, "to teach me how to open my heart again. I don't have to be alone anymore." As darkness settled, Lily leaned into Daniel, looking up at the two women. "Daddy," she asked innocently, "did Mommy really save a life?" Daniel kissed her forehead. "Yes, sweetie, and the life she saved is sitting right beside you." The three hugged tightly, a man, his daughter, and the two strangers who were no longer strangers, connected by a single act of profound, selfless heroism. A neighbor passing by reported the scene. "I saw them sitting on the porch, the four of them, holding hands, not saying a word. You could hear the wind and nothing else. Just people who had lost everything, finding each other in the quiet desperation of a small town." From that day forward, the farmhouse was no longer a symbol of abandonment, but a hub of fierce, hopeful reconstruction. Daniel stopped viewing the renovation as a mere construction project. It was now a spiritual act of healing, a tribute to Megan's legacy. He felt a surge of energy he hadn't known since Megan's death. No longer running from the past, but honoring it with every hammer swing. The house became a physical manifestation of their collective healing. They worked as a unit, each member finding purpose in the shared endeavor. Daniel, utilizing his engineering background, focused on the structural integrity, fixing the roof and running new plumbing. Grace, the former nurse, took charge of the logistics, transforming the overgrown yard into a thriving vegetable garden, supplying them with fresh food. Grace meticulously planned the garden, viewing the act of nurturing life from the soil as her own personal form of physical therapy. Elena, quiet and artistic, found her voice. Elena began painting the interior walls. Her first creation, in the very room where her mother had died and she had been born, was a sweeping mural. A woman with a kind, smiling face and wind-tossed hair, her arms outstretched, bathed in sunlight. Below it, Lily painted in large, childish script, "For Megan." The mural was stunning, a testament to Elena's talent and a permanent, beautiful memorial. One afternoon, Daniel found Elena sanding an old window frame. He paused his hammering. "Did you ever meet her?" Daniel asked quietly, referring to Megan. Elena shook her head. tears welling slightly. Only for a moment. She looked fierce, and her eyes were the warmest I'd ever seen. I remember the pain leaving, replaced by a sudden, intense warmth. Daniel smiled sadly. That was her. She always carried the sun in her pocket. This shared moment cemented their bond, moving it beyond obligation into genuine, mutual respect. The home ceased to be the farmhouse and became a sanctuary where lost souls found a second chance. The air was now scented with fresh paint, Grace's cooking, and the vibrant life of Lily's laughter. The dark, foreboding corners were filled with light and purpose. The house no longer groaned. It breathed. A local reporter, drawn by the strange story of the newly bought, suddenly inhabited house, visited the property. Grace, usually reserved, spoke with powerful clarity, standing next to a thriving patch of newly planted squash. This house, Grace told the reporter, her hand resting on the smooth, newly sanded wooden banister, was once the resting place of a woman who died saving another. Now in a strange, beautiful circle of grace, it is saving the lives of those who were left behind. It is a lighthouse, guiding the shipwrecked back to shore. Daniel looked at Elena. Her eyes, once clouded with deep, impenetrable sadness, now held a clear, determined light. The light of someone who finally had permission to live. If my wife were alive, Daniel said, his voice thick with emotion, she would be so happy to see us, her family, finally caring for this place. She never wanted anyone to feel the loneliness she sometimes sensed in the world. Elena replied, her voice steady and sure. Without her, I wouldn't exist. Without you, I wouldn't know where to call home. This house is a testament to her heart. It is the only place where my grief and my gratitude make sense. Lily burst through the screen door, covered in dirt from playing in the garden. I named the house, she announced, beaming. It's the lighthouse. We need to put a big shiny sign out front. Daniel smiled, scooping her up into a hug. That's a perfect name, sweetie, because we found the light in the deepest darkness of our loss. We found our home. From today, I choose to look at people for more than one quick beat. I choose to see the hidden connections and the unwritten stories. I choose to be vulnerable and open. I will live kindly. 1 year later, the farmhouse standing proudly against the endless Vermont sky was unrecognizable. It had been meticulously restored, painted a soft, welcoming sage green, and featured a new front porch wrapped in climbing roses. A simple hand-carved wooden sign hung from the mailbox post, the lighthouse, free shelter for wanderers. Daniel, Grace, Elena, and Lily lived together, a beautiful, unconventional family. Daniel had started his own small, successful engineering consulting firm locally. Grace, strong and vital, ran the household and the garden. Elena, flourishing in the stability, had started teaching art classes to local children. Her first official student was Lily, who now proudly drew family portraits featuring 4 distinct, smiling figures. But the lighthouse was more than just their home. It was a sanctuary. They began informally offering their spare rooms and couches to those passing through, people who were lost, newly homeless, or simply needing a warm meal and a moment of peace before moving on. They never asked for money or names. They only asked that the visitors pay the kindness forward. Each person who stayed added a new story to the house's healing narrative. The old cross, etched into the wall of Elena's birthroom, was preserved, now encased in glass, a permanent, silent reminder of sacrifice. On Christmas Eve, the 4 of them sat by the stone fireplace, Lily unwrapping a small hand-knitted scarf from Elena. Daniel pulled out the old rust-stained letter found in the mailbox. He read Megan's words aloud once more. If anyone reads this, please know that one life saved another life, and the light never goes out. Daniel finished, his eyes meeting Elena's across the crackling firelight. She's at peace now. She knows her light is still burning here. She found her forever home right where she was needed most. Elena reached for his hand, her gratitude palpable. And we, Daniel, will keep that light burning forever. We are her legacy. Every person we help, every meal we share, that is a page in her continuing story. Grace looked over them, her face serene. We all ran from something, Daniel. You ran from grief, Elena ran from hopelessness, and I ran from debt and loneliness. But this house, Megan's ultimate kindness, it didn't let us run away. It brought us together to finally rest. Daniel stood up, walking to the window. The lights of the farmhouse shimmered in the snow. I remember thinking the city was going to kill me, he murmured. But then I found you two. I realize now that love isn't something you run to. It's something you build where you stand. And Megan gave us the foundation. The final scene, the four of them, Daniel, Grace, Elena, and Lily, stood outside in the soft, falling snow, stringing lights along the eaves of the lighthouse. The warm golden glow spilled out onto the white, pristine fields, a beacon of hope against the winter darkness. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told, leave a comment and subscribe. We tell the stories that shouldn't be forgotten.